One of the tremendous beauties of cinema and one of the real sources of its focuses of its aesthetic language is the human face. A painter, of course, can represent the face in a different way and maybe a more beautiful way than cinema, but cinema can show us the face in all its tensions, all its movements, all its subtlety, and it can turn a face into something familiar. Part of what I wanted to suggest is that this idea of the blandness of a face. I mean, the actor who probably is portraying the serial killer has a genuinely bland, strangely bland, unnoticeable face. But this blandness is precisely the point. What we want, what the kind of ideological desire for us wants, is that evil appears in an evil way, that the serial killer has strange, strong features, like an unusually prominent brow or sharp features, that there's something ominous in his face. But here you have this totally bland face. So the question then, is this a mask for some sort of evil that is extraordinary? Or does it represent precisely the blandness, as Hannah Arendt might say, the banality of evil itself? That even the most sort of extraordinary evils that people fixate on, that they derive some sort of, that they have such a fascination for, are fundamentally bland, right? That this isn't some extraordinary, extravagant, horrific height of human nature, but maybe just our bland existence as animals.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new year. Welcome to a new episode of Korea Deconstructed. Thank you for continuing to be here with us. I hope you're all well. Today I'm joined by Professor Anthony Curtis Adler, who teaches continental philosophy, literature, and critical theory at Yonsei University's Underwood International College. His latest book is one that I have in my hand here, and which I've recently read. It's titled Bong Joon, Filmmaker and Philosopher. So today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be talking about Bong Joon. Love to hear what you think about it soon. Anthony, it's wonderful to see you. We've just enjoyed our coffee together.
Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here to talk about Bong Joon and my book.
Excellent. And it's a wonderful book. Let's start, if we can, perhaps, Anthony, by talking about Bong Joon himself, because I'm sure most people are familiar with his name, and they might have seen one or two of his films. What can we say about Joon?
Yeah, wonderful question. I mean, I think for most people outside of Korea who aren't film studies people, aren't deeply immersed in the world of cinema, he's famous above all as the director of Parasite, which achieved the incredible feat of winning both the Palme d'Or and Cannes and also the Oscars for Best Picture, which is pretty much unprecedented for a foreign film and very rare to win for any film to win both of those awards. So he became famous for Parasite, which obviously intrigued people and interests people in many ways because of its deeply disturbing presentation of class relations, as well as just this extraordinary kind of beauty and dramatic tensions as a film. But obviously his film career goes back much earlier than that. And he's, in fact, the director of, at the time of the book, 7 films, now 8 major cinematic releases, starting with Barking Dogs Never Bite, which was kind of a cult film that didn't have much impact at the box office, but also Memories of Murder, which really made him well known among major directors in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm. He has a reputation, perhaps in Korea, of being a director of socially oriented movies. When I speak to people about him, they said he makes films that society needs, things like this. Before we look at individual films, do you think sort of Bong's reputation in Korea, or how has the situation here in South Korea, because it's come through military dictatorship, it's come through modernization, it's come through the Asian financial crisis. Bong Joon himself was put on a blacklist of artists in 2014. How do you think South Korea's domestic situation has affected him and his work?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the domestic situation in Korea is evident not only in his Korean films, his films that are exclusively in Korean language, but also in his bilingual films and even films like the latest one, Mickey 17, which is almost exclusively in English. So, you know, even as he's migrated away from, migrated towards international reputation, towards Hollywood, towards films that are more geared for an international audience, the experiences in Korea have always continued to motivate him. And I think, you know, it's an interesting question. Why are people in America so drawn to Korean cultural products now? Films, television shows like Squid Games. And I think one thing that really strikes me is that the Korean situation in some ways is more, the tensions are more on the surface, but it's also simpler because political and economic questions are not confused or complicated in the way they are in America by the question of race and ethnicity. And so people can see a film like Parasite where the class issue is absolutely front and center, and it's not obscured or it's not complicated by matters of race, of ethnicity, of whether people are natural-born Americans or immigrants.
That's a really interesting observation, that we don't have to look at anything through the lens other than class. And Bong Joon does focus a lot on class in his movies. He's very, it would seem, class conscious. He's very sensitive to these ideas. He hits on the things that would seem you're not meant to talk about those, especially in this kind of Cold War divided country where ideology is a big thing. And yet here is Bong Joon and he spends a lot of time looking at the poor, the rich, the disabled, the oppressed. He's very class conscious in the way I understand him.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think somehow, like when I was growing up, my parents were sort of Anglophiles. So my mother in particular loved upstairs, downstairs.
Most people listening won't know what that is.
It's this British show that was all about class relations in a way, like for her, like British TV shows presented the reality of class in a way that was impossible in America, because in America, class is something that is unspoken. You're not allowed to think about it. You're not allowed to think of a society that is divided by class. And so in a way, it's similar now with Korea, that it's sort of presenting this political unconscious, this forbidden content, which is also, of course, represented in Parasite very beautifully with The Basement.
Yeah.
This wonderful, like, hidden, mysterious bomb, what is it, like a bunker where, the excluded, the most marginalized member of Korean society is stuffed away in a sort of living, self-willed, voluntary entombment.
And he's rather happy by it as well, as long as he has his sex bananas and physical releases. He's quite content with it. I think it's very interesting because I've never really considered this, that we often talk about why can't we be a utopia, why can't we all get along, if only we got past these racial divisions, and that's the reason for the troubles in society. But what you see here in Korea is they are all essentially one person. It's a very homogenous society, and yet there is still class. So even if you get beyond race, that's not going to solve the problem of class. In your book, you grouped Bong Joon-ho's movies into 3 categories, not quite chronological. It's very interesting what you did here. So I'll put this out, and you can see where you want to go with this, Anthony. You started with Barking Dogs that deals with spatiality, and that was a category all by itself. And then you put Memories of Murder and Mother, dealing with provincial crime and a mythic sense of memory and genre. And then the third category you put with globalization and monstrosity, including The Host, Snowpiercer, and Okja. Parasite was the epilogue, and Mickey 17 hadn't been released at the time when you wrote and published this book. So tell me about the organization of the movies, because it's not quite chronological. Tell me about how you've decided on that framework.
Yeah, I realize it's a curious choice, because obviously the most natural decision in organizing a book about a filmmaker, about an author, is to do everything chronologically. But I think, so partly what I wanted to do in this way is emphasize a thematic development and not submit my discussion too much to things that might in fact be accidental. I have a strong feeling with Bong Joon that he's such a thoughtful filmmaker that his entire work in a way develops in a very powerful way that expresses an vision of what film is, that it's not necessarily evident in any single work, even though it's sort of reflected in every work. So in some sense, I mean, the organization is arbitrary, because you could find temporality in Barking Dogs Never Bite. You can even find a trace of globalization. So it's not so much that I'm saying, oh, this film is only about this and this film is only about that, but rather it's just a way of sort of finding my own path through the dense forest of his cinema.
Let's start with what you start your book with, which is his first feature film, which is Barking Dogs Never Bite, which Bong Joon-ho himself describes as a stupid black comedy. I laughed so much when I was watching this movie, but I also grimaced incredibly and sort of gripped my chair and said, don't do that. Tell us about this film, because it's a film that probably many people have not seen. And when I posted this on the Instagram page of Korea Deconstructed, which is your favorite Bong Joon-ho film, many people, there was a selection for every movie except Mickey 17 and Barking Dogs Never Bite. So let's give this movie some love.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say I think that it's objectively, to the extent that any aesthetic opinion can be objective, his best film.
Right.
But I do think it is profoundly underappreciated, possibly even by Bong Joon-ho himself. I think he probably had his own ironic reasons for distancing himself from the film. The theme of dog eating, I don't know if there's a fancy Latin or Greek word for that, is a theme that probably is not one that anyone really wants to foreground in discussions of Korea. But at the same time, I think, just the choice of the theme itself is brilliant, because it captures in a nutshell the transformation that has taken place in Korea. I was speaking with our veterinarian a while ago, and she herself explained how, 20, 30 years ago, pets weren't really a thing in Korea. Whereas recently, when one of my cats died, I went to this cat mausoleum, cat cemetery, cat crematorium, I'm not sure what it is. And it was this amazing sort of almost perverse testament to Koreans' affection for those domestic animals. There's even this girl with her boyfriend who is wailing for an hour and a half in the most exaggerated fashion over the death of their dog. Yeah. And so, this is how much things have changed, that, a certain animal species is somewhat arbitrarily gone from being an object of domestic consumption or a work animal. You still see, if you travel to rural Korea, Jindo dogs tied up in these miserable conditions with chains, as guard dogs, to becoming something that's treated almost as a member of a family. And Barking Dogs Never Bite, the entire plot hinges on this social transformation, the way that, the dog. You were talking earlier during our cafe conversation about Schrödinger's cat. It's sort of like Schrödinger's dog. It exists in all these different functions, which really kind of unfolds, develops entire tensions within Korean society.
Yeah, because if you, in that Schrödinger's dog analysis, if you are poor or working class, you at that time you see a dog as food, you see a dog as nutrition, and if you're old, the grandmother, you see the dog as a substitute child, that maternal instinct playing out, and she calls it baby and in the Korean, and for others it's a form of sort of social advancement. We have this luxury pet now, and our dogs have autism and they need counseling and funeral homes and things like this. It's a wonderful film that he does that. He said himself when it was coming out and it was being played at film festivals in London and Hong Kong, that there was documentaries being shown in the United Kingdom at the time about Koreans eating dogs. And they're like, please don't talk about this and show it. He's very brave in what he puts in films, and it's there from the very start. What is the film about beyond dogs? So it's about the transformation. Can you say anything else about this Barking Dogs Never Bite? Because, there's Beheduna, there's all these characters, there are these themes.
Another thing I think is, in many ways, I think my own sort of maybe perverse sounding contention is that Parasite is basically a do-over of Barking Dogs Never Bite. Mm. They're very similar films in many ways. And above all, because they're both focused around, situated within a built environment. So for myself, one of the reasons why I was drawn to Barking Dogs Never Bite and even to Bong Joon-ho is because when I watched the opening scene of Barking Dogs Never Bite, it's like I was looking at my own life. I mean, a life that sort of belongs to me in a way is perversely weird in terms of a world explained in this film, because I'm precisely the outsider actually taking a Korean job as a professor, which, something that in some weird way I feel a bit of guilt about. Mm. But here I was living in an apartment that's almost identical to the apartment in the movie, looking out a window towards a very, very similar sort of greenish background in the early fall that seems sort of resemblant of suggests a world that's totally detached from the interior space of apartment. But yeah, I mean, for me, fundamentally, Bong Joon-ho's Barking Dogs Never Bite is, as much as Parasite, it's about class relations. Because if you actually look at the film, it's almost Platonic in its divisions. You have a professor or an aspiring professor who basically wants a life devoted to contemplation, for whom the barking dog is this nuisance that he has to eliminate. And then you have the character played by Beheduna, who's this kind of a low-level office worker who wants nothing more than glory. She wants to be on TV by catching the evil dog eater. And then finally you have a janitor and the homeless person who regard the dog as food, right? So the entire, this fundamental class divisions understood in a kind of ideological way in terms of the desires people have, the aspirations people have, is figured through the dog.
Beduna's performance in it is wonderful, and she would return in The Host. I think she plays in that. At the end, because it's about spatiality, one of the ways you've looked at this, at the end of the movie, and it's very old, so spoilers are allowed, Beheduna and her friend, they walk off into the forest, into the countryside. Right. They leave that spatiality around which the whole movie was fixed. Can you say something about the ending for me? Because I was watching it while the credits roll, and the credits roll while this happens. It's very interesting. What happens at the end of this movie?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you mentioned that. And again, this is a point of comparison with Parasite, which almost awkwardly ends with this sort of epilogue that takes place in the forest overlooking the Parasite house. But yeah, I mean, for me, this is really the quintessential, the beautiful, defining moment of a film, because what it really shows is that these characters have an aspiration for something that is fundamentally outside of a circuit of values that within the society they are condemned to live by, right? So even though all of them are aspiring something, be it, contemplation and glory as an academic also, or glory as a dog killing as someone who catches dog killers, or even food, there's also this aspiration for the outside, for just something as simple as walking through the forest, through this uncontrolled kind of overflowing errant space. And so the irony of the film then is that even though the main character, the protagonist, Yunju, gets what he wants, he gets his job, and I guess in a way his wife also gets what she wants because she still gets to keep the dog, it's really Bae Doon-hud who doesn't get what she wants. She doesn't get the fame that she expected, who nonetheless kind of find something else, another possibility, another way of living. And I think within Bong's films, there's always this moment of the sort of the entrance into the exteriority, the kind of frontier. Even in Parasite, it's also figured through Dae-sung's sort of obsession with American Indians and the teepee.
Yeah. And Snowpiercer and what's outside the train, exactly, what's outside this location, this kind of a return to nature almost, like this primitive, it's fascinating. And you said something, Ali, and I want to keep coming back to this as we go through, but it's about this idea that you need to watch all of Bong Joon-ho's films to get this holistic interpretation. And I understand what you say about you could put Barking Dogs Never Bite next to Parasite, but you could also put it next to Snowpiercer. And by watching Barking Dogs Never Bite, you understand Parasite better and you understand Snowpiercer better. They all add up to a totality of this whole of Bong Joon-ho's canon of work that he's produced. It's a fantastic film, this Barking Dogs Never Bite, and I really do hope more people go out and watch it and what it's achieved there. Perhaps I think my favorite movie of Bong Joon-ho's, but let's move on to Memories of Murder. If we have something, we'll come back to Barking Dogs Never Bite. I've often said this, and this is a controversial statement because we're talking about Bong Joon-ho, but I prefer Park Chan-wook and Lee Chang-dong's work to Bong Joon-ho's in general, so I'd put maybe number 3 on the list, but I think Memories of Murder might be my favorite Korean film. And the thing about this movie is it's not meant to work. It's not, if you describe it to someone, you'll think like, why is that a good movie? What is it about this movie? But I watch it, I've watched it multiple times, and every time I watch Salina Chuok, Memories of Murder, I just think, my God, what a movie. Before any philosophical analysis comes in, I just think that is an amazing piece. And to go from Barking Dogs Never Bite to that is something.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And it just shows his incredible versatility as a filmmaker, which, I think also that's what I find so fascinating, that he's incredibly versatile. But unlike most artists that are incredibly versatile, like someone like Steven Spielberg is also incredibly versatile, but you don't feel that there's a deeper point that he's really making. You feel like he's sort of like a jack of all trades who, if given a script, he'll come up with a decent film out of it or a great film out of it. Yeah. But with Bong, you feel like even though he's versatile, he's using these different genres to say something more. And so definitely, the translation from Barking Dogs Never Bite to Memories of Murder, obviously, like strategically, career-wise, it was a great move because, serial killers are a lot more interesting than dog killers. And killing dogs is not something that really registers in people as an interesting subject for a film. Whereas people, for whatever weird reason, have this absolute perverse fascination with serial killers. And he obviously recognized it. And obviously when you're dealing with serial killers, when you're dealing with this sort of violence, it becomes a very delicate game. How do you enter into it without either moralizing or glorifying? And certainly I think one of the things that makes Memories of Murder such a wonderful film is that even though the subject is the serial killer, it actually says much more about society than the serial killer itself.
Yeah.
There's no attempt to enter into the mind of a serial killer and explain why he's committing these atrocious deeds, right? But rather, in some ways, it becomes comprehensible through the social malaise that is depicted, as if in a way like this irrational act of violence were a sort of senseless reflex to a society that also is sort of going off of its hinges. Or
the society is violent, the society is oppressive, and that's what allows the killings to take place. And it's interesting, he goes back in time for this, where it feels like Barking Dogs Never Bite is looking at society changing and moving forward to pets becoming sort of these commodities and the commodification of these. Memories of Murder, he deliberately goes back into sort of dictatorship Korea, 1980s, and he presents a society that's oppressive and violent and swearing and dark, and you really get a sense of this was not this romanticized Korea of the past where everyone was beautiful to each other before capitalism arrived.
Right, yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, it's a society that's incredibly violent, and where, you know, the thing about a violent society is that there's an ideology of violence, and the ideology that supports violence is the idea that violence is necessary, that it's necessary to suppress evil. And yet the irony of the film is that the violence of a police officers is in the end completely incapable of addressing this evil within society, because the evil in society is really actually a reflex of the violence that the police officers themselves represent.
And the violence is humorous at times. I know this is a weird thing to say, but drop kicking people down paddy fields and the constant use of the foot and things like this, it's he makes me laugh amidst this darkness. There's something interesting, if I can draw your attention to this, that you said in your book, where you're saying about how we should read this movie. You give, in the opening of Memories of Murder, which is this wonderful scene, you provide Nam Lee's description of the opening. And here you get the blue sky and the rice fields, and you kind of suggest that we shouldn't, a literary cinematic reading ignores something important, that if we read him and his movies through the traditional cinematic literary lens and look at what's happening, we miss something. I was intrigued by this idea.
Yeah, well, I think what I was trying to argue is, I mean, Nam Lee's discussion of a film is brilliant and has a lot of wonderful things to say. But for me, like, the way that she describes the opening scene is too willing to impose a kind of literary metaphorics on the scene itself. And so basically what I was saying is, like, of course, like, the golden rice stalks is representative of something, it's symbolic of something, but its cinematic function is not identical to its metaphorical meaning. To understand how this scene works cinematically and to understand the sort of thought process, or to at least reconstruct one possible way, to give at least one possible reconstruction of the thought process behind it, what you really have to do is to see it in a completely cinematic way without carrying over these metaphoric associations. And so that means, you know, when you see the boy sort of peering out mysteriously in the rice stalks, what matters is not simply that he's a boy who symbolizes, I don't know, Korea's innocence, and the rice stalks, which symbolize fertility and healthy nation, but actually just how this scene actually works, how the camera is revealing things to us. Because this is really the most amazing potency of cinema, that it controls our vision, that it has this amazing ability to control what it shows and what it does not show to us. And above all, that something quite different than literature, it can show us things without showing them to us. That it can show us things in a kind of latency.
There's this element of watching Barking Dogs Never Bite and, let's say, Park Chan-wook's films, where I know I'm watching a movie, where the cinematography is so striking. They're saying, look at these colors, look at this mise en scène, look at the way I've framed this shot so magnificently. I'm telling you, and it's beautiful. It's art. You could freeze frame a lot of, Park Chan-wook or, the apartments in Barking Dogs Never Bite and find a beautiful frame. In Memories of Murder, it feels a bit different, as if almost you forget you're watching a movie sometimes. It's moving along, it's taking you, and I love that. What do you think, because you've written a bit about this, what is the film saying about modernization, about technology, about music, about memory?
Right, that's the big question.
It is.
But first of all, with modernization, I mean, this is obviously a fundamental point about kind of crux of the film, that you have these different police regimens, these different logics of criminology. And so the real tension is between the old regime, which is based on some combination of brutal violence. You have a bad cop and the slightly better cop. But above all, not just brutal knowledge, that's sort of trivializing it. Beyond violence, what it really depends on is local knowledge. And this is not irrational. It corresponds to a certain concept of crime, right? In the old days, in a pre-modern world where you have a local community, if someone commits a crime, it's going to be someone who is going to commit a crime. Crimes are going to be committed by certain people that are, for the most part, marginalized members of a community, weirdos who would have sort of become identifiable as such, because the local community is itself a system, sociologically speaking, of knowledge. People within the local community know each other. And one of the things that modernity brings is the stranger, the outsider, the wanderer, we now have a wonderful English word, the rando. Just the person who, why is this person here? What are they doing here? Suddenly, cities become full of random people moving from one place to another place, people who don't know each other. And this, in turn, requires a fundamentally different method of criminal inquiry. And obviously, the serial killer is the essence of this, right? Because the serial killer is someone who's committing a crime who, on the one hand, they're going to appear like a perfectly normal person in many cases. They're going to be socially adapted, like Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. But on the other hand, they're committing a crime that has no social meaning other than being completely destructive, completely negative, completely perverse. At its most comprehensible, some kind of private sexual fetish or sadism. At its least comprehensible, just a total act of nihilistic destruction. And so in this way, the serial killer is opaque to this local criminal knowledge, this older form of criminology. The serial killer requires a new method, which what Detective So represents in Memories of Murder. The detective who comes from Seoul with, he has some college education. He represents this new form of scientific criminology. But of course, the perverse outcome of the film is that even this new scientific technology represented by the, at the time, quite novel technology of DNA identification also doesn't suffice. And so in the end, neither the old regime or the new regime is really able of making sense of this sort of crime. So, that's one way in which modernization is represented. But another way in which it plays into the film is just in the representation of this town, this city itself, which is, all of a sudden a basically rural environment has become subordinated to the imperatives of capitalism, of industrial growth. So as I understand it, the Gibson mine, is, which figures prominently in the movie is providing a main ingredient for concrete. And so while, in the metropolis, you have this amazing boom of building new apartment buildings, all of these raw ingredients are coming from somewhere. Obviously one of the nice things about living in a big city is you don't have to be aware of or think about where anything comes from. It just comes. But for the city represented in Memories of Murder, Hwasong, it's really it's much more disturbing. This modernization is disfiguring the city. It's ruining the natural environment. It's changing it from basically a rural place into a kind of dystopian environment where you have this looming, dangerous, frightening looking, ominous would be the word, mine, and also these railroad tracks, which of course figure prominently. And the railroad is this emphatic signifier of modernity. At the time I wrote this, I'm obsessed with Russian literature, and I was reading Tolstoy. And of course, for Tolstoy, the train is something that sort of represents above all else modernity as a kind of force of fate that can't be resisted. And so in Memories of Murder, the train it's not just a train, but the tunnel, which destroys the landscape, or which cuts through the landscape, which no longer follows the sort of natural errant paths of the landscape, but cuts through it, choosing its own straight path.
And visually, it's black and it's dark and it's the abyss. And this is something that I see constantly come up. It's the downstairs in Parasite, which is a black, dark tunnel. It's part of the host as well, this space in which things emerge from and which you can't see. And perhaps we'll talk about the ending, because you wrote this analysis of the ending, Anthony, and I'd like to share it, and I'll read it, because most people, when they look at the ending of this movie, the common analysis is that Song Kang-ho's character, when he breaks the fourth wall and he looks into the camera, what he's doing is he's looking into the cinemas of the country and saying, where is the killer? And the actual killer did go and watch this movie, we understand. But this is what you wrote, and I'll read this passage from Anthony's book, Bong Joon, filmmaker and philosopher, quote, "Memories of Murder's final shot certainly suggests that the murderer could be anyone, even someone in the audience. In fact, the actual murderer did watch the film, but it also carries a more disturbing message. The potential for sadistic sexual violence is not an extravagant exception to human nature. It's not extraordinary, but ordinary, plain, bland. The human face thus becomes the site of mythic tension. Far from revealing the soul's depths, it conceals them. Every human face hints at the existence of a moral character that remains yet unknown, at powerful drives hidden beneath the surface." Say something about that. That's Dostoevskian, almost.
Thank you. That's for me a great compliment. Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, like one of the tremendous beauties of cinema, and one of the real sources of its focuses of its aesthetic language, is the human face. I mean, a painter, of course, can represent the face in a different way and maybe a more beautiful way than cinema, but cinema can show us the face in all its tensions, all its movements, all its subtlety, and it can turn a face into something familiar. And so part of what I wanted to suggest is that this idea of the blandness of a face, the actor who probably is portraying the serial killer has a genuinely bland, strangely bland, unnoticeable face. But this blandness is precisely the point. In a way, what the kind of ideological desire for us wants is that evil appears in an evil way, that the serial killer has strange, strong features, like an unusually prominent brow or sharp sharp features, that there's something ominous in his face. But here you have this totally bland face. So the question then, is this a mask for some sort of evil that is extraordinary, or does it represent precisely the blandness, as Hannah Arendt might say, the banality of evil itself? That even the most sort of extraordinary evils that people fixate on, that they derive some sort of, that they have such a fascination for, are fundamentally bland, right? That this isn't some extraordinary, extravagant, horrific height of human nature, but maybe just our bland existence as animals.
And that exists inside of us and in the systems. And that face that you talk about of the possible serial killer, I believe if I get my facts right, that's Park Hae-il, who also plays in Park Chan-wook's Decision to Leave. Putting those two together is fantastic. While we talk about this, and just as we move on maybe to Mother, because there's a lot of films to go through here, I really want to make it clear that while you analyze these films through a wonderfully philosophical and all the interpretations, I think we need to make it clear to people listening that these movies are fun to watch, though. Sometimes you hear about these deep, it sounds like hard work and all of these things, but they're fun to watch as well as being richly rewarding at the same time, which I think is Bong Joon-ho's greatest credit here, because some films are fun to watch and some films are very interesting to analyze, but you put them together, and I think that's what makes Bong Joon-ho special. To move to Mother, which you put in this kind of countryside memory genre thing, what surprised me most when I was watching Mother is that Bong Joon-ho did something outrageous, which is he made the disabled child, Won Bin, the actor, he made the disabled child the killer. Kill. And I was like, you wouldn't be allowed to do that these days. That's politically incorrect. We have certain sensitivities. But what I like, and Bong Joon-ho often features people of disability and oppression, that comes up constantly in it. And here he has one. And when I saw that, I was like, Bong, you're outrageous for what you asked me to do with my own morality. Tell us something about Mother.
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, that's an excellent point, and it makes me think of Oasis, where, the point, which is, a much more conventional, wonderful film, but a film that's much more sort of conventionally reflective of a kind of socially minded attitude at the time that it was made, where the disabled or the mentally disabled boy and the handicapped, physically disabled woman are presented as sort of unproblematic heroes, as virtuous, as opposed to a society of people that are using them and exploiting them and scapegoating them. So you're right. I mean, in Mother, it's strange that you have this seemingly mentally disabled child who is, in fact, not guilty, who is guilty of a crime that, when you first start watching the film, you think, oh, he's not guilty, he's being scapegoated, but it's actually not what's happening. And that's sort of a brilliance, that he becomes that he's a murderer and his mother becomes a murderer. Not spoiler alert, but
it shows us our prejudices, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When we watch it.
But another thing, another aspect of it that I find interesting, which is related to this, is that it's not clear whether he really is mentally retarded. At the end of the film, it seems like his supposed mental impairment is actually a result of his totally toxic, weird relationship to his mother, who domineers him, who needs him, who at first tried to kill him, and maybe that could have caused this some sort of brain damage. But the real source of his problem is that she's completely codependent on him. And so at the end, it's actually weirdly not really just a film about murder. It's a film about liberation. In the end, the mother is being liberated. She's running off on this bus, maybe having fun with some men at the destination that she's taken to. And the son is liberated. So they both actually become individuals.
I think you phrase it in the book, the umbilical cord is finally cut after 30 or whatever, how many years it is. It wasn't done at birth, but it's a psychological umbilical cord that connects these two.
Right. I mean, this is a woman who watches her grown son pee.
Yeah.
They sleep in the same bed. And so suddenly at the end of his film, these things no longer seem normal to him.
It's fantastic performances in this. Uncomfortable to watch. And dark but humorous, sexual, perverse, rural, pastoral in places. And then the ending where she sort of gives, because we could talk about the endings of Bong Joon-ho films quite a lot, but this is one that invites quite a bit of interpretation and analysis. I'm not sure your thoughts on it. I read one Reddit post of all things, which suggested she might be in hell, one of sort of Dante's Inferno circles where she was now being sort of in that sense. What happens at the end of Mother, when she's on the bus, when she's dancing, once she's injected herself with the needle? Is it important to you, or?
No, I think it's very important. And cinematically, it's just an extraordinarily beautiful film. I can't describe how beautiful it is, but the combination of the lights, the way the dancing bodies are represented in this completely prosaic tour bus. So I guess one thing I have to say is my wife suggested to me, and I have no way of really confirming this, but she suggested that buses like that were sort of this thing where they take old people to a place for a day where basically they would hook up and then get taken back. And that's how I'm not sure if that's totally correct, but that's how I interpret it. That for her, she's sexually liberated, right? Because up until the film begins with her son trying to have sex with someone, which is what ultimately leads to this horrific murder. But at the end, she's also sexually liberated. Her life, her entire adult life, basically, her son has been the substitute for a lover. It's almost like a kind of parthenogenesis. But as for what happens with the acupuncture needle, right? I mean, obviously, one interpretation of it is the site that she's jabbing is the site, her thigh is identified by her with memory, right? So in the end, it's like she's showing that she has this own power over her memory, right? And memory is very important because with memory comes trauma. And she's obviously someone who, as unsympathetic as she might seem as a murderer, is also someone who's been profoundly traumatized by society and whose crimes also in some way result from trauma. And so at the end of the film, it's like she's gaining control over her own memory through these sort of mysterious, almost shamanistic powers that she possesses. And that also is what liberates her. So I guess, I would probably not interpret it as hell. To me, that's too sort of figurative, although it's an interesting interpretation.
I think it would be wise to trust your wife. We just had coffee with her as well, and she seems like it's on there. The idea of old people going on these buses and hooking up, it's often associated with hiking and in the mountains. I was told recently, you can check this with your wife, Anthony, that when you go hiking, if you have one trouser leg rolled up, that indicates you are open to suggestions from other people on the hiking. So part of the culture here, perhaps. And as we move on to the other category, I think it'd be important to say this, that the movies, when we talk about this violence and the things that are happening, first of all, these are not incredibly gory movies. We sometimes have this image of Asian cinema being difficult to watch, or Tarantino has a reputation for doing this. But while there are some uncomfortable moments, perhaps, these are not overly gory or difficult to watch movies, despite the violence presented. And I think that's to Bong's credit. And the other point here is we've gone through perhaps three of the movies in terms of the overarching morality. it's very difficult to find good guys and bad guys in his movies, that if you approach his movies with this kind of, well, this is the protagonist, this is the antagonist, this is the person I'm rooting for, this is the person that needs to be overcome, they quite simply don't exist. And this was very eye-opening for me watching Asian cinema, watching Korean cinema, because my whole frame of reference was all of a sudden lost, and I had to see it. And in Bong Joon-ho's oeuvre, sometimes it becomes very difficult to find the bad guys. And I think that's where his best work is. When it becomes a bit more obvious, Mickey 17, perhaps, Okja, it loses a little bit of that punch. Do you have any thoughts on this morality perspective?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I agree. It's funny also because when he's dealing with, in his purely Korean films, like Memories of Murder, Mother, it is exactly very difficult to find bad people. The structural violence, in a way, dominates over individual culpability. And so it's very much a sociological perspective in that way. But in films like Okja or Snowpiercer, you have these sort of exaggerated evil people, many of whom are played by Tilda Swinton.
White people.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a little bit in The Host as well.
Right.
American.
Personally, it doesn't bother me in any way, but it is to some extent problematic. I mean, there is a kind of racial coding in his film. I think actually the most interesting case of it is The Host, where you have this sort of military autopsy person, or I don't know.
People doing the quarantine and the chemical, biological.
Right, and even at the beginning, like the military person who tells his Korean assistant that, oh, it's okay to dump the formaldehyde into the sewer. You have to think broadly. So even though in his Korean films he's very nuanced in his representation of good and evil, in his less Korean, the globalization films, in a way, globalization becomes represented as a white person, which is curious.
Do you have any? Yeah, the anti-Americanism is really something, isn't it? I mean, it's featured there, but that's also a feature of the South Korean left, I think. That would be their political argument. There are currently 28,000 American troops stationed here in South Korea, and for many that is a liberating force, and for other people it's an oppressive colonial force. And for other people it's just something in between. But Bong Joon-ho, like the references in Squid Game, for example, the VIPs, they're almost sort of grotesque caricatures that are focused on sexual depravity and these kind of things.
Right, and also maybe very could be seen as anti-gay.
Yes, and really homophobic and not very well acted, if I might say. The depictions of them, this kind of Occidentalist view. But Bong Joon-ho comes back to it a few times, this anti-American feel, and you put this together in this sort of globalization film. Now, let's say something about the Host. I'll come into this with a quote from your book, if I may, please. And I quote from Bong Joon-ho, filmmaker and philosopher. It should not surprise us that The Host was Bong's first great commercial success. The nearly perfect realization of the Korean blockbuster, it had ended up doing just what one feared Hollywood would do, dominating screen time and stifling competition. For many cinephiles, its success boded ill for the future of Korean cinema. To remain competitive, Korean films would now have to assimilate Hollywood's most problematic tendencies, with a black and white vision of good and evil triumphing over moral complexity and nuance, violence taking the place of dialogue, and introspective depth vanishing behind a cartoonish facade. Bong Joon-ho's first monster movie, like a physical monster rather than a systemic monster. Tell us about Bong Joon-ho and the monster movie, The Host, please.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you read that quote. It's a wonderful point of departure. Coming back actually to what we were talking about earlier with his representation of white people. I feel like in The Host, he's playing a very dangerous game. He's trying to produce a Hollywood-style film without playing into the ideology of Hollywood, without playing into this sort of epic representation of good and evil, that's been sort of foisted on us ever since Star Wars or before that. This sort of epic world where you have the evil forces and then you have the good guy.
Was that not before Star Wars?
Oh, definitely before Star Wars. I just think of it as kind of forcing its way without the possibility of resistance.
We are also white and black today, by the way.
Right. So, like in The Host, he's definitely struggling with this whole question of what it means to represent evil as a monster. And one of the things that's very deliberate about The Host that he talks about a great deal is that the monster there isn't this sort of striptease of a monster, as he puts it, where we see a little bit of a monster and then a little bit of more. The monster is just out there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's also no real moral ambiguity to the monster. It doesn't seem like the monster is maternal. It doesn't seem like it's taking possession of his children could be interpreted as an act of love that maybe took an improper form. Right? The monster is grotesque. And so, the question, I guess, that I struggled with in reading and interpreting this film is, how is it possible still to read it as if he's ultimately deconstructing the monster? And I think it is, although only in a very, not in an obvious way. I mean, I think partly the way that he does it is by showing how the monster itself becomes invisible to the authorities, right? That we see the monster, the family sees the monster, but what do the authorities see?
Schrodinger's monster.
The authorities see the virus.
Yeah.
They see this existent threat, which they then fight through the most monstrous means possible, through this, Agent Yellow, that destroys all life form, which is obviously, a completely absurd sort of facetious idea, and at the same time, obviously reference to Agent Orange. But so even though we see the monster disappears in the eyes of authority. So I think there is something subtle that he's trying to say about globalization and representation.
I'm not sure if you addressed this in the book, but I remember you talking about, for example, Mother. The title is Mother. It's not Oma. It's not Omoni. It uses the English word and it sounds uncomfortable on the tongue. It's not something, it sounds weird in Korean to do it like that. The Korean title of this movie is Kwemul, which kind of means monster, but the English title of this is The Host.
Right.
And I think that also implies this sort of colonial, anti-American, but also virus aspect of the movie that the Korean title doesn't quite get at there. By calling it The Host, you're looking at, host of a virus, host of an invading body. So he's really looking at this kind of, these American people on our soil. I think one of the most interesting things about this movie is that you spend most of the movie with these people undertaking a mission, which is to save the young girl, to save the daughter. And like many of, his previous work, it fails.
Right, yeah.
The girl dies. You watch this whole movie, they're trying to save the girl from the monster, and if you've watched Aliens, if you've watched them, Ripley chase after Newt and things, of course they get the girl back. But in this, the girl dies. Right. It's an outrageous move from Bong.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that is totally subversive of the expectations of the monster film, of this sort of epic Hollywood horror film where you expect ultimately that the good people will triumph, that they will kill the monster, that they will save a girl. But even though the girl is not saved, the other child is saved. And it almost is like you're witnessing his birth out of the belly of a monster, and then he's adopted. And for me, this is actually the critical point in the film, because within a Korean context, adoption is very controversial. It's not something that's strongly supported by Korean culture. The idea of family, identifying family with blood, is very strong. And so in some sense, I see in this in the end of a film where the kind of a misfit character adopts this child who was saved from the belly of a monster, a certain kind of critique of not globalization, not American globalization, but actually this idea of ratio-ethnic purity, which is sort of counterpoised to globalization, is often sort of accepted even by the left, or maybe especially by the left, very as a sort of antidote to colonialism.
And perhaps it's interesting, I'm not quite sure, but they replace a girl with a boy.
Right.
It's like the disappearance of, we've lost our daughter, but we're okay. We've got a boy now. And so it might be addressing adoption, it might be addressing globalization, but there might be something about the disposable nature of women in this as well. The monster is defeated by a homeless guy throwing Molotov cocktails. And it has, I'm sure there is this idea that, people will say, you mentioned your wife looking at the bus, and when she saw the bus at the end of Mother, for her, that was a bus in which people go on a jolly when they're a certain age. And I'm sure that Korean people would be watching this, and I've heard them tell me that they learned how to throw Molotov cocktails. And by that, I mean soju bottles stuffed with alcohol and lit on fire. And you have to do it underarm rather than overarm so it doesn't run down your arm and sort of burn things. That watching these films through Korean lenses and international lenses, we might, there's different things resonating with us. And I think in The Host, at least, and until this point, Bong Joon-ho is very Korean. He hasn't made that turn to Okja and Snowpiercer. And that turn is very noticeable, I think. And I applaud his bravery in doing it, in growing out of Korea and trying these things. I'm not sure if Okja and Snowpiercer were my favorite of his movies, though. I felt removed. I felt there was something missing. I'm not sure what you feel about this.
Yeah, I just could I say something about what you said about the ending, which I think is an excellent point, that there also is this disposability of women. In a way, also the monster can be seen as a kind of representation of this feminine force that is actually lacking in the family, right? The mother is absent from the family. The only woman is someone who sort of has, in a way, renounced her stereotypical femininity by becoming an athlete, an archer.
A failed one at that.
Yeah, a failed one, or at least a mediocre one. I mean, I'm not going to argue with her archery skill, but she does triumph in the end, I guess, with the monster. But yeah, so there is this interesting message about the disposability of women and the ambiguous, dangerous role of a feminine within Korean society. A kind of, which maybe goes back to that people argue that that before Chosun, there's a strong matriarchal component in Korean society, which was really repressed, leading to a patriarchal society. But even so, there's matriarchal elements of Korean society. Ajumas are powerful. And shamans tend to be, we think of shamans, we think above all of women who also are like locuses of this sort of spiritual power. So in a way, also, the reaction to globalization is to kill this maternal element, to destroy it, which ultimately can be seen as weakening. But yeah, I mean, coming back to your question about the transition from Okja to Okja and Snowpiercer, I actually like both movies. I think that he's learning things. And I'm not sure he's still learned. I mean, to me, they're actually more successful as films than Mickey 17. I think Hollywood is very hard to resist in its corrupting powers. I like those films, but I do agree that they're not as perfect as Memory of Murder or Mother or Parasite, for that matter. And that he's struggling to deal with globalization in an adequate way. He's struggling to come to terms with it.
How do you see the relationship between, and we must applaud his bravery, by the way, this constant desire to flip in. There's remarks about bands such as the Ramones or AC/DC, and they just make the same album like 15 times. There's a wonderful quote where somebody says to Angus Young of AC/DC, what would you say to people that suggest you've just made the same album 20 times? And he said, it's wrong, we've done it 21 times. And some people, they have their thing, and that's good. And I love Bong just for moving into these things. The relationship between the monster in the host, which we've looked at in this maternal, and there's nothing good about it. And then we also get a very large creature in Okja. What's he doing here? Because he's got these huge, large creatures in two movies here. Is there any connection between them?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think that, again, both films have to be seen in relationship to each other. Also, Okja is a mother pig, eventually. A maternal figure. And there, I mean, precisely we talked about how sort of in the host, the girl is destroyed. She dies in the end, but it's the opposite in Okja. So in a way, Okja is sort of almost a triumph of this maternal matriarchal power that is suppressed and transformed by that the globalizing system seeks to transform into a source of profit. I mean, there's a lot you could say about sort of a relation between ecology and economy, and the way in which ecological ideas of growth, of fertility, are transformed in capitalism into economic productivity. And so in a way, like in Okja, the maternal is somehow being defended against this force of globalization that seeks to commodify everything, that seeks to consume and destroy.
Rape, almost. There is some scenes in Okja where it feels that he's pointing at sort of the rape of women, or the rape of nature, the rape of Korea during colonial times or something.
Right, yeah. I mean, with the so-called veterinarian, the beloved TV personality who is in fact revealed as this sadist torturing Okja.
Who would have thought giving TV personalities control of things could be a bad idea? Bong Joon. I love what he's doing with these. We think he's brave. Snowpiercer? With Snowpiercer, it's very on the nose, isn't it? It's very much, here's a class, here's the lower class, here's the upper class. It almost feels to me like a computer game. It almost feels like you go through this level, you go through this level. There's a linear progression, and nothing ever feels really surprising to me. There's not a big twist. I think the moral element that we've talked about before is a little bit clearer in Snowpiercer. I've not read the graphic novel, so I'm not sure how close it is to the original content. Can you give us something about Snowpiercer in this context?
I mean, my sense of it is the graphic novel is actually quite different. It's much, the movie's representation is much simpler. And, you know, even though the basic premise is obviously the same, the political moral world of the graphic novel is actually quite different, because you have collaborators, or not collaborators, you have rather people among the passengers who are actually concerned, philanthropists, who care about the fate of the people in the behind, which is something completely absent from Snowpiercer. But yeah, I agree with you about this sort of almost mechanical progression. For me, though, that was something that was deliberate, in a way also brilliant, because it's it was a perfectly Aristotelian film. It was perfect unity of time and place. The plot is actually completely plodding, it just plods forward from car to car. And so, there is this sort of reductivity to this reduction. It's reductive on the one hand, but the virtue of it, I guess, for me, is that it really brings out it brought out the very way in which the reductive plot and the train as this technological system of control are actually one and the same. And so the sort of mechanical plot and the mechanical system of oppression that pretends to care about ecology are sort of are brought very close together. They're one and the same thing. But yeah, I mean, I agree that there are not many surprises, but there were a few, and I do feel that there was a way in which Snowpiercer was actually undermining this strict opposition of good and evil. Although maybe more on the side of having the people that are good actually appear evil in the end. So, the whole thing with Gilliam actually being on the side of Wilford. I don't know. I mean, that was a bit of a twist for me. I have to admit, I didn't totally see that coming, even though I guess it could be seen as sort of the only way that the film could go. And so, yeah, I mean, for me, the whole idea that basically this Christian ideology of sacrifice was actually one and the same as the violent ideology of control was actually an interesting and a sort of disturbing point that the film was making.
It's, for me, it's so interesting to see somebody working with foreign actors and not dividing things between Korean cinema and Western cinema, blurring these lines between what's acceptable. And I think that's what's really interesting about Bong Joon-ho's work. And Na Hong-jin's got one coming up this year with Michael Fassbender and Hwang Jong-min and things like this. That's the director of The Wailing and The Chaser and things like that. I think it's really interesting to not divide movies as we have been doing. And Bong Joon-ho was... I'm sure there are other examples of it, but I think what he does in Snowpiercer and Okja, and it's really nice to bring people together and have them acting in the same movie and speaking on the same screen, not always as antagonists. You don't really spend much time in your book on Parasite. You say that people have said too much about it. And I would probably agree with you, but there might be some people, it's like that they get into Korean cinema through Parasite.
Right.
And we're obviously a little bit older as well. Some people discovered K-pop through BTS, and then, you work backwards, and that's how it happens. I think we should say something about Parasite.
Oh, yeah, and to be clear, I mean, I Parasite is definitely the most talked about of his films, but I do think that it's a wonderful film, and there's a great deal that could be said about it, and should be that still is waiting to be said about it. And partly the reason why I spent less time on it was just strategic. I mean, it's the last film, and honestly, I already exceeded the page limit for the manuscript. So by the time I got to Parasite, I would have had to cut out a lot of more to leave open space for it. But that said, I also feel that if you actually look carefully at his other films, the things in Parasite can be understood as bringing together those elements. And it wasn't necessary to spend so much time on Parasite in order to make that clear.
I think this is a really interesting point, and I said we'll come back to it, but I agree with you 100%, but I'm not sure I can articulate it perhaps as well as you might be able to, which is that if you watch all the films leading up to Parasite, you understand Parasite differently. I'm reluctant to say better, or more accurately. But I think there is something, and you've said about this, that you get this holistic understanding of Bong's work through repeated tropes, messages, ideas, symbolism. And I've noted this in, Park Chan-wook's work as well. It's like, this is self-referential at times. They're doing these things, and, Tarantino will do similar things, but you don't normally get that in movies or from directors. So can you perhaps give us something on this idea, Anthony?
Exactly. And for me, the perfect example of this is this figure of the outside. There's this wonderful documentary on Netflix about the film club that Bong Joon belonged to, The Yellow Door, I think it's called. And it shows his first stop-action film, which is about this gorilla this toy gorilla. I love that theme of abandoned stuffed animals, by the way, that's struggling to return to paradise. And ultimately it does return to paradise, but it's actually watching a TV on paradise. So to me, in some way, like Bong Joon-ho's films are always repeating this basic idea, which is this search for an escape that the media itself renders impossible. And so, there's always...
What does that second part mean? Search for an escape that the media renders impossible?
Well, yeah, because the question is can there really be an outside? Can there be an escape to the system? And I think he's using cinema as a means to represent the escape. But the moment that you represent the escape is also something, this is sort of a deconstructive logic that's captured within the medium, that's captured within the system of representation. And so it only becomes a kind of pseudo-escape. So I think he's always struggling with this. He's always trying to think of a way of representing an outside to global capitalism, in other words, to maybe repressive Confucian social structures. But he recognizes that this utopian instinct is always going to be subverted through the very means that try to produce it. And so, for example, in Snowpiercer, you have this idea of, the end of a film, the train is destroyed. The outside, finally you can get to the outside. But what is the outside? It's this freezing wasteland where most likely you're going to be eaten by a polar bear. And so, he's trying to imagine an outside. In Parasite, the boy artistic genius Da Sung, he's obsessed with the frontier. And obviously in the figure of the cinema, in the history of the cinema, the West, with the American Western, the frontier is of amazing importance. And so he's sort of dreaming of a frontier, which is the way the locus classicus of Hollywood cinema. And so, coming back to what were you asking?
I was asking how watching all of the movies building up says something about Parasite, this holistic...
Right, yeah, so in Parasite in Parasite, the end of a film is in many ways totally perplexing. It struck me in some ways as awkward, surprisingly awkward for a film that was so celebrated.
I wish it didn't exist, that ending.
Yeah,
just cut it early.
Honestly, I never like epilogues. I hate encores at concerts. I enjoy films, but in some ways I want things to kind of come to their natural point of ending. And the perfect point of ending would have been the party and its tragic debacle, and not this weird afterword. But the whole point of afterward, which I think really only becomes comprehensible in light of his other films, is this representation of the outside. And for me, the moment really in which you see this in a very subtle way is with the rock, this mysterious rock, which is, so I tried to do a lot of research into this in writing this book, because I had no idea what scholars' rocks were, but it's actually very interesting. And these are rocks that Confucian scholars would possess, that were meant to they have different functions, but above all, they're objects of contemplation. But at the same time, in Korea, in the 80s, they become sort of coveted commodities by upper middle class businessmen who couldn't afford calligraphy. So rocks were the second best thing. And so the rock is this object which sort of commands the entire film. It controls the entire film. It's almost exerting a magical power over the characters. And at the end of the film, the boy, he takes this rock and he removes it from its pedestal and he puts it back into the river. And so this is sort of this symbolic moment of liberation, which suddenly the rock, which is this representation of nature in all its spontaneity, is returned to nature in such a way that it ceases to become a representation, right? The beauty of these water stones or these scholar stones is they become representations of nature through the simplest act of taking a rock, admittedly a well-chosen rock, and putting it on a pedestal. And so the moment that you take it off of its pedestal, the power of representation loses its force and it returns to nature. And to me, this is really like this quintessential, I talk a lot in the book about Taoism, this really Taoistic moment of refusing the power of representation.
The Tao that can be Taoed is not the true Tao.
Yeah, exactly.
Every word has an opposite and a reflexive. And so if you say good or bad or night or day or truth or beauty, tall, short, every word that you say has by its nature an opposite, but nature doesn't have an opposite. There was something I found very interesting. I'm not sure your take on this as we bring this to a close, which is that in the Greek world, as it were, or in the world that perhaps we understand it, nature refers to everything except us, humans. Nature refers to mountains and birds and trees and the sky and clouds. When we talk about nature, we talk about everything that is not human, that is not literature and culture and philosophy. But when the Taoists and the Buddhists and the East Asians, when they talk about nature, we're included in that picture. We are part of that collection of nature. And I always found that very interesting. I love what you're saying about here, Bong Joon-ho looking for this outside, looking for systems and looking at our place in them, whether it's the rock or whether it's the puppy killer. And it's fascinating that perhaps his anti-capitalist movie, for example, of Parasite, is incredibly successful in a capitalist system. That, even this is Mark Fisher and capitalist realism, that even to critique capitalism generates lots of money.
Yeah,
so it reifies the medium or reifies the system.
Yeah, it's something I'm deeply concerned with, deeply interested in. Exactly.
I think this conversation has been fascinating, Anthony. Is there anything missing here on Bong Joon-ho, his work, or something that you think would be important to add?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much I can't even think of what's not that. I mean, we've said so much, and there's so much to say, so it's hard for me to think of anything that's missing. But I did want to come back to what you said about these different ideas of nature, which is something that I've been interested in since my graduate school days. And I actually wrote my dissertation on Friedrich Hölderlin, and a main focus of my interest is the way that he actually really returns to a view of nature, which I'd say is maybe this original Greek view of nature, which is very close to the Taoist view of nature, but it's one that becomes suppressed by Greek metaphysics, by Plato and Aristotle, and eventually by this whole view of history as opposed to nature. And so for Hölderlin as well, like nature and history is not opposed to nature. Humanity is something that comes forth out of nature. And so I see a very similar perspective actually in Bong Joon-ho. Yeah, I mean, another thing that I might, one thing I just might add is, I think what really makes Bong Joon-ho a great movie director, and I agree with you, I'm not sure he's the greatest Korean movie director. I'm not really interested so much in making those sorts of classifications. And in a way, he's not the director who I find most simpatico. But I think what makes him a great movie director is that he knows what cinema is. And he really deeply understands the powers of cinema, which are not just storytelling, which are not just another means of achieving conventional narration, but above all, the powers of a visual medium, a kinetic medium, that can say things that a literary text simply cannot say.
Mm.
And so in a way, like, I see him very much as a filmmaker who, despite the popularity of his films, despite the accessibility of his films, is really telling us a great deal about what cinema is capable of.
Yeah. I echo all of those. And while we have sort of maybe, or I at least have said something about some of his movies or work that I wasn't as keen on, this is not important to anyone but myself, but he seems like a genuinely funny and humorous and artistic and brave and courageous man. And I think that goes a long way. And sometimes it shouldn't be understated that, sometimes that people that exist and create great power and things like this, they can become corrupted by it, or they can become boring, they can become aloof, they can become, Harvey Weinsteins and sexual predators and things like this. But here you have a man like Bong Joon-ho who has told America or the wider world, once you get over the problem of subtitles, you'll be getting somewhere. He's a man that sort of said, I'm going to get drunk tonight and have a good time. And he seems very comfortable in his own skin. He seems very in tune with who he is. And that's why it's interesting looking at his movies, because they all seem like him. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, he said that, and we didn't talk about it, we'll leave it for another time, I think, that Mickey 17 was the only movie that was offered to him that he accepted. So I was listening to an interview and he said he was offered Mickey 17 to do this and he's always turned them down. And for some reason, he decided to do that one, this idea of copying humans. So that maybe explains it a little bit for me, knowing that. I might ask you, please, Anthony, 2 or 3 recommendations to close this out. It doesn't have to be related to Bong Joon-ho. It doesn't have to be related to cinema at all, but movies, books, albums, documentaries, a couple of things to keep us going.
I don't know. I don't. I'm very, my tastes are very short-lived. I get very excited about things that I'm reading the moment. So I'll just recommend, I'm reading Notes of a Crocodile now, which actually my niece recommended to me, or she wanted me to buy it, but by Kui Mao-jin. I'm probably mispronouncing that name, but it's really it's a wonderful Taiwanese novel that really captures something very beautiful about young people and their strangeness, their strange ways of being in the world. So yeah, I'd recommend that. I guess this isn't so much of a contemporary reference, but I feel as a Hölderlin scholar at heart, I feel like I should recommend people read Hölderlin because he's really not read very much in Korea.
I must confess, I haven't read much at all.
No one has. He's very important in Germany in some ways, although probably not anymore. But he's not in Korea. He's not nearly as read. He's not nearly as much read as, say, Goethe. Even though I feel like actually he has something very profound. His works relate in a very profound way to Korean experience. And part of what I was trying to do in this Bong Joon-ho book is sort of find my way cautiously to that connection. So.
Well, I congratulate you on the publication, Anthony, of this book, Bong Joon-ho, filmmaker and philosopher. I loved reading it because I love Korean cinema. I love Bong Joon-ho's films and I love philosophy, and you've put them all together in this. Thank you for being here with me today and sharing this great enthusiasm and discussion. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation for me.
And to all of those of you listening, once again, Happy New Year. I hope you all remain warm, well, and full of positivity. For those of you who can, get in touch and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All good and relaxed. Fantastic. I love how you come to life when you start talking. We're in the coffee shop and you're quite quiet and things like this. And then we put a microphone in front of you, Anthony, and we say, right, tell us about this movie. And bang, here it comes.
Yeah, I think it's because because I'm a naturally very introverted person, but I've been teaching for 20 years, so I've kind of developed the ability to turn on a kind of transient extroversion. But I have to say, I think you did a wonderful job, and it wouldn't have been easy for me had you not asked such good questions.